I'm JG Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the program, we'll be hearing from regular guest in his, basically at this point, monthly visit to the show, James M. Dorsey of the Turbulent World blog. He is a journalist that covers the Middle East, but this conversation will be focusing on some issues outside of the Middle East, namely U.S. foreign policy and international relations in the age of Trump. We'll talk about Venezuela, Greenland, and this whole Board of Peace, which initially seemed like it was going to be about Gaza, but if you read the charter, Gaza isn't even mentioned. So what is it about? This conversation was recorded on the 21st of January. I note that because a lot is developing right now. And I think you'll find it rather enlightening, even if we don't have all the answers at our fingertips. There's a lot up in the air. In any case, I hope you enjoy the conversation with James, and as always, if you can, please consider supporting me on my Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And be sure to visit the website and newsletter of my one and only sponsor, Mike Swanson of Wall Street Window, wallstreetwindow.com. Mike will give you the best financial and trading news. And to tell you the truth, I've had listeners make a return on investment thanks to Mike's trading tips. So head on over to wallstreetwindow.com where you can get a copy of his free ebook, The Twofold Formula, the single best trading pattern I have ever used. You get the ebook if you sign up for the newsletter, so check that out at wallstreetwindow.com. And with that being said, let's get right to the conversation with James Dorsey. Welcome back to Parallax Views for his regular visit on the program. James Dorsey of the Turbulent World blog. How are you doing in these very turbulent times?
You know what they say about journalists. The worse everybody else is, the worse off everybody else is, the better off a journalist.
So I know that your focus is sort of on the MENA, Middle East, North Africa, but I think that what's happened in the past month with both the capture or abduction of Maduro, this Venezuela operation that the Trump administration undertook, and what we see with Greenland now, and also the sort of fallout from that with the Prime Minister of Canada basically saying the U.S. rules-based order is like dead. I think all of this will connect to the Middle East in some way. I mean, I think it, you know, we live in this rapidly changing world. How is the Middle East going to be affected by all of this?
Well, in a sense, you could argue, and I've been arguing that in a story I published yesterday, and again in a story that I'm going to publish tonight, that the Board of Peace is a catalyst. So if you go back and you think about what the Board of Peace was supposed to do, it was supposed to be a transitional authority that would run post-war Gaza until Palestinians took over governance of the Strip. That's not what the Board of Peace is today. So when you get the signing on Thursday at the World Economic Forum in Davos of the Charter of the Board of Peace, that's a very different charter. In fact, it doesn't mention Gaza. It essentially speaks about a institution that would be permanent and that would rival the United Nations peacekeeping efforts, which are the globally endorsed efforts. With other words, it's the beginning, in principle, of an alternative structure of the world order. And in many ways, it's an autocrat's dream. All power is centered in Donald Trump as chairman of that board. Now, he is as chairman of that board as the president of the United States, as long as he is president. But the charter leaves open, or suggests even, that he could remain the chair of the Board of Peace even after his presidential term ends. Now, I think what you're seeing, or what you're certainly seeing, is up until now, it's been a relatively meager group of countries that have formally agreed to join this board. And they are expected to pay $1 billion each if they want to have a permanent seat on that board. And who sits on the board is ultimately exclusively Donald Trump's choice. Where you're seeing the resistance, where you're seeing the resistance to the board is from the Europeans. And that's both a function of the broader issues the Europeans have with Donald Trump at this point, but it also has to do with that very autocratic structure of the board, as well as the positioning of the board as an alternative multilateral organization instead of the United Nations. And Trump, with his remark that the United Nations isn't functioning, has reinforced that notion. So you get the combination of a board of peace with a charter that doesn't mention what it was supposed to mention, and articulates goals that were not discussed, coupled with Venezuela and the legality of the apprehension of Nicolás Maduro, the president, and his wife, irrespective of what you think of Maduro and his wife. And you get the potential showdown that we may see over Greenland. And yes, it's all interconnected. In some ways, you could argue, not only is it interconnected, but at this point, the Europeans are the spearhead of whatever resistance there may be to Donald Trump's plans.
So if we could, because I feel like we may have jumped in the deep waters very quickly there for some audience members. If
in
they
the Middle
don't,
East, you always jump into deep waters.
that's true. So this Board of Peace, though, was initially meant to basically be a proposed international body intended to oversee the reconstruction of Gaza and promote global stability. I think Jared Kushner was also involved as one of the founding executive board figures. But it sounds like this potentially isn't just about Gaza anymore.
Well, okay, let's go back to the history.
Right.
The history is Donald Trump came forward with a Gaza ceasefire plan. That plan had two or several phases. The first phase was the release or the exchange of all Hamas-held hostages, whether dead or alive, in exchange for the release of a significant number of Palestinians incarcerated by Israel. And that once that had been achieved, then there would be a second phase in which Israel would withdraw from the territories. A board of peace would be installed that would be made up of regional powers primarily. A international stabilization force would be introduced into Gaza that would, whose mandate is still a bit unclear. With other words, what is it responsible for disarming Hamas by hook or by crook, or does it come in on the basis of an arrangement with Hamas in which Hamas agrees under whatever terms and in whatever process to disarm. And it under the Board of Peace, you would have a Palestinian committee that would run the day-to-day affairs of Gaza. Now, what you have today, or what you're now getting, is the inauguration or the signing of the Board of Peace's charter this week. The charter does not mention Gaza. It does not mention an international stabilization force. It has a much broader mandate, a multilateral mandate. And what you have is a three-tiered, envisioned three-tiered post-war administration of Gaza. Now, the first tier is the Board of Peace. You have 3 Arab states that have said they will join: Bahrain, Morocco, and the United Arab Emirates. It's highly likely that Qatar and Turkey will join. And then you have an assorted 4 or 5 states, Kazakhstan, Paraguay, a couple of others, who will join. Tellingly, Benjamin and many leaders have been invited. Tellingly, the Europeans are not joining, at least with the exception of Hungary, and it's not inconceivable, and Belarus, if you want to count that as a European country. But tellingly, Prime Minister Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, has been invited to join. And as Donald Trump was making his way to Davos, Netanyahu said he would join. Tellingly also, there is no Palestinian representative on the board. And the Palestinians obviously feel that Netanyahu, given that he has been dragging his feet on a lot of stuff, and opposes the inclusion of Turkey and Qatar, that he's going to use his membership in the Board of Peace to try and delay, if not derail, issues. Now, then you get a second tier of the of this whole administration of Gaza, which is sort of an executive board, and it's an executive. It's the executive of the Board of Peace, and that's made up of Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, Steve Witkoff, the Trump's special envoy, Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, the president of the World Bank, and if I'm not incorrect, a National Security Council official. And then you get the Palestinians. And that's a technical committee that is supposed to run the day-to-day affairs of Gaza. With other words, ensure that there's a distribution of goods and services. Now, it's not clear what these $1 billion contributions will be allocated for, whether that's going to be allocated for reconstruction of Gaza. There's already problems with the Palestinians barring members of the Palestinian Committee from entering Gaza. So, in other words, you're dealing, one, with a very different animal from what was originally conceived, and two, with already a very problematic start.
Now, it's interesting. You have a poll up on your Substack. You said, and the poll asked the question, does the Board of Peace cross a line? And the options you left are yes, no, board challenges the world order, the board is not about Gaza, and then Gaza has no alternative. I'm wondering why you framed it with these options and where you stand on this.
Well,
I hope that's not too loaded, but
no. In terms of the 3 options, forget the yes or no. I think all are correct. In other words, fact of the matter is, Trump's Gaza ceasefire plan is the only game in town. The alternative is no ceasefire, and we go back to a situation in Israel does what it wants. Does it cross a line? In my mind, it does, in the sense that it lays down a gauntlet in challenging the current world order. Now, you can argue that Trump has already done that with multiple steps, including Venezuela, including his concept of dominating the Western Hemisphere, in terms of when he was asked, I believe, by the Washington Post, he said there was nothing that restricted him except for his own moral judgments. His a foreign policy that is based on coercion and on intimidation and on the principle might is right, I think challenges the world order. So yeah, in that sense, I think this is a major development. The consequences of the degree to which it succeeds and the consequences of this approach, in part we've already seen, but there's much more to be seen as we move forward.
How important is what has happened in Venezuela and the apprehension of Maduro? Because I think this is basically Trump saying, the idea of international law doesn't seem to matter at all.
I mean, look, the comparison for the apprehension of Maduro is, of course, Noriega in Panama. But those situations were very, very different.
I believe you wrote a whole article about this too.
Yes, I did indeed, and I covered Panama, the invasion, and in fact, I covered the run-up in the couple of years before that of Panama, and the year after. So Panama was very different. For one thing, you had U.S. military bases in Panama, which you did not have in Venezuela. You had a popular revolt going on. There were protests. So Venezuela was very different. But, the fact that you simply can violate the sovereignty of a country and apprehend the president and transport him to the United States to face U.S. justice raises very complicated issues. Now, Europeans may not be afraid of that, but, for example, the Iranians could very well be.
I wanted to talk about Iran actually and what has transpired. I know a lot of people were triumphantly saying this is the end of the Islamic Republic last week, and it doesn't seem like that has transpired. Trump has sort of, I guess, given Iran a chance, as some people have put it. What do you make of what has happened with the Islamic Republic? We went from protests and threats by Trump to, things have quieted down now.
Sorry. I mean, let's be clear. There is deep-seated dissatisfaction in Iran among the public. And there's been that for quite some time. These were not the first protests, and they're not going to be the last protests. Even having said that, this is probably one of the most serious challenges that the government in Iran has encountered. However, there are building blocks, and this one was driven by economic concerns that are real. You have a country in which inflation runs over 40%. If the currency has collapsed by 90%, people can barely make ends meet, and that's what took them to the streets. And as we frequently see, those kind of protests driven by a particular concern often evolve into becoming much more political. And the longer they take place, the more that's going to happen. And that's what we saw in Iran. Now, I think there's one other aspect to this, and let me be clear: these were genuine, Iranian protests inspired by Iranian concerns. There was no foreign involvement in sparking the protests. But you've had a brutal crackdown by the government, in which supposedly some 3,000 people were killed. But you also had 100 or more than 100 Iranian security officials killed. That's a significant number. And what makes it, what makes the notion that, at least in the violence coming from the protesters' side, there may have been foreign interference. I mean, you've had unprecedented, in my mind, Mossad, the Israeli Foreign Intelligence Service, on the official X account of the Mossad's Farsi-speaking spokesperson, say, "We are on the ground. We are with you."
I was going to say real quick as well, we had in the U.S., Mike Pompeo was on X, thanking the Iranian protesters and then saying,
correct,
as well as the Mossad on the ground
correct,
beside them. Yeah,
correct. So you had the Mossad saying it essentially. You've had Israeli ministers saying it. You've had the diplomatic correspondent of Channel 14, which is the most pro Netanyahu television station in Israel, actually saying we're supplying firearms. And then you've had various statements by prominent Americans, whether that's former Secretary of State and former CIA Director Mike Pompeo, Lindsey Graham, and various others. So, in other words, there's circumstantial evidence that that the Israelis may have had an involvement, not an involvement that should call into question the legitimacy of the protesters and their genuinity, but that does raise the question whether Israel was trying to provoke a situation in which things would escalate to a degree that regime change would be possible. Now, keep in mind, for regime change, you need to have a number of things. Protests help, but you also need a split within the Iranian security and military forces. And there is no split, at least no public split. What I do think is that ultimately the protests are going to lead to some kind of change. It's not going to be a radical change of the regime. It's going to be change from within the regime. That may not be a sudden and overnight change. It could be gradual change. But you will see change. And which way that change goes and what it produces is anybody's guess. In other words, do you get an Iranian government that follows the Venezuelan approach and seeks some sort of accommodation? Keep in mind that the government and the supreme leader are in a catch-22. They need to structurally address Iran's economic problems. To do so, they need sanctions relief. And for that, an arrangement with the United States, with the Trump administration, is necessary. Now, the problem is that Steve Witkoff has laid down what Iran would have to do to come to a deal with the United States. And some of what he wants, for example, ballistic missiles, is something that no Iranian government, whether Islamic revolutionary or post-Islamic revolutionary, would be able to agree on, because that's the core of their defense. Now, obviously, the other alternative to the Venezuelan approach is a much more hardline government.
I wanted to ask, in terms of, I don't want to get into the speculations too much about Mossad involvement in Iran, but I do wonder, um, do you think that these statements by Pompeo and Israeli officials could have led, do you think that made the situation worse in terms of the crackdown? 'Cause I don't know if I think any state is going to react to those kind of statements with a more brutal crackdown because it induces paranoia.
Look, I think that the paranoia may have been there even before. Yeah. Go back to first of all, you've had for several years, if not more, Israeli targeting certain Iranians. You've seen a series of Iranian nuclear scientists being killed in Iran and elsewhere. What you saw certainly in the two instances where Israel retaliated during the Gaza war against for Iranian attacks, pinpointed intelligence that they were operating on. You saw the degree of the infiltration of Iran by Israeli intelligence with the killing of Ismail Haniyeh, the leader and the negotiator for Hamas, who was in Iran at the invitation of the Iranians to attend the inauguration of President Masoud Pezeshkian. And you saw the degree to which Israel knew what it was doing during the last June's 12-day war. So the paranoia was there.
It's not even, and it's not necessarily unjustified either.
No, it's not unjustified, of course. And what the statements by Mossad, by Israeli officials, by people like Mike Pompeo does, it bolsters the Iranian argument to try and, in a sense, delegitimize the protests by saying this was all a foreign plot.
Can you speak a little bit more to the issues Iran faces with regards to economic dissatisfaction amongst the populace, or if people are unfamiliar with that aspect of all of this?
Look, essentially, Iran's economy is a basket case. That is a result as much of mismanagement of the economy, of widespread corruption, as it is of U.S. sanctions. So for Iran to, you've seen prices shoot up, you've inflation being rampant, the money they have being worthless. So those are issues that the government has to address, which means a restructuring of the economy, which means weeding out at least a significant degree of corruption. And it means the ability to be able to access the international banking system, to be able to import goods, to be able to export goods. Obviously, Iran does some degree of export, particularly of its oil, which is its main export commodity. But all of that is done in a way that it evades U.S. sanctions. What that also means is that Iran doesn't get what the world market, the way prices for a barrel of oil. It has to discount. It also means that over time its oil facilities degrade. Look at Venezuela and what it would take to bring Venezuela back online in terms of where it should be on the oil market. So those are big ticket issues.
There's been reports that and I don't know. I've only seen a few different news sources say this, and I don't know how reliable they are. Saying that Saudi Arabia, along with Qatar and Oman, um, basically told Trump give Iran a chance to de-escalate. What do you make of these reports? Do you think there's truth to that, or
Well, what I think the truth is, Iran has been very clear. If the United States were to intervene in Gaza, allegedly to protect the protesters, they would not want to see U.S. operations, military operations, take place from U.S. military bases on Saudi, Qatari, Emirati soil. Uh, the reason for that is several-fold. One is that the Iranians have made very clear that if the United States would intervene, then they would retaliate against U.S. bases in the region.
you said a second ago Gaza? Did you mean if they were to intervene in Iran?
Yeah, I meant
Okay,
if they intervene in Iran.
okay.
Sorry about that. The Iranians have made clear that if the Americans intervene, they would retaliate against U.S. military bases in the region and potentially against critical infrastructure, for example, oil facilities. Keep in mind that there are no U.S. or Israeli targets in Iran. So by definition, any retaliation would have to be cross-border. That's not something that the Gulf states want to see. What they're focused on economic development, on economic diversification. They need to see stability in the region. They found an arrangement with Iran that doesn't necessarily restore full confidence, but allows them to a degree, to freeze their differences and to focus on things they can do together and on mutual assurances. If you didn't have U.S. sanctions against Iran, you would have seen massive Gulf investment in Iran. Sorry, if you didn't see U.S. sanctions against Iran, you would have seen massive Gulf investment in Iran. So yes, the Gulf states have made very clear to the United States that they don't want to see that they don't want to see a U.S. intervention. The U.S. problem at the time that it seemed imminent that the United States would intervene was that it had limited options at that moment. With other words, it could fly bombing missions with long-range bombers out of bases in the United States or out of Guam. It did not have an aircraft carrier group in the region that would have allowed it to operate offshore in a sustained way. Now that obviously will change once the U.S. aircraft carrier groups that are on the way to the Middle East arrive.
So it sounds like the concern for the Gulf states during this period where we could have potentially seen a strike on Iran was mainly regional stability.
It was regional stability and not wanting, essentially the risk of a U.S. intervention was that this would escalate into a region-wide conflagration. And they did not want to be sucked into such a conflagration, in addition to their preference being one of stability rather than another war.
I also wanted to ask, and this is sort of a side note, but I told you before we began the show that I had the modern scholar of the Middle East, Professor James Galvin, on the show, and I mentioned him the way the media has talked about rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran that was mediated by China, and he said I think that's been overstated. Is what he basically said to me. He said it's not a rapprochement so much as a detente. I was wondering what you think of that. Do you think there is an overstatement of how the Saudi-Iranian relationship has changed over the years, or
First of all, in my mind, the Chinese help in restoration of diplomatic relations between Iran and China. This was in the relations were broken off by Saudi Arabia in 2016 when its embassy was ransacked in protest against the Saudi execution of a prominent Shiite Muslim cleric. This was handed to China on a silver plate. Saudi Arabia and Iran have been talking for 2 years with Iraqi mediation, Omani mediation, and they then went to China to give China the honors of announcing the restoration of diplomatic relations. What I do think is James is right. This is a detente. No issues have been resolved as such. What they've done, and if you go back a few years, you had a Middle East that everybody was fighting with everybody. The Saudis were against the Turks, the UAE were against the Turks. You had the boycott of Qatar for 3.5 years, led by Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt. So everybody was basically having tense relations with everybody else. It came to a point where the Gulf states, but also a country like Turkey, decided that this isn't going anywhere, and this is disrupting what their priorities are, and therefore you entered a phase which was symbolized by this Saudi-Iranian detente, if you wish, in which issues were frozen, differences were frozen, and they focused on economic cooperation, for example, and increasingly you're seeing degrees of military cooperation. So that's where the Gulf states are, and that's paid off for them since in recent years, and they don't want to see that disrupted. Now, would the Gulf states potentially want to see a change of regime in Iran, provided that does not produce greater instability? Obviously, they would. But the regime is the devil they know,
rather than the devil they don't. Yeah, I see.
Rather than the devil they don't, and they found a modus vivendi that, at least for now, works.
In terms of the Islamic Republic, where do you think maybe Western commentators or commentators in the U.S. are getting the Islamic Republic wrong in their analysis? Or because, as I've said, every few years it seems like there's this. I'll see an article saying these protests are going to be the final end, the nail in the coffin for the Republic, and it doesn't pan out that way. What I mean, given that you've watched this for so long, why is that? And where do you think maybe some analysts are getting the Islamic Republic wrong?
I would say more than some analysts. But look, first of all, I think when you get big ticket stories like Iran, the experts come out of the woodwork. And so you get a lot of prediction that may not be rooted in an understanding of Iran. But I also think that you have another issue. You have countries like Iran, to a degree Qatar, for example, that evoke deep-seated passions. There's very little gray middle ground. You either think Iran is evil incorporated, or you think it's a revolutionary force and that's being subjugated by American imperialism or what have you. And the truth is in the middle. Iran is not an easy regime to deal with by any stretch of the imagination. And they're not nice guys by any stretch of the imagination. But there is a strong pragmatic trend in Iran that often gets beaten down by the projection of hostility that you've seen by Western states, including the United States. Now, to be fair, the U.S. has a very complicated history with this regime. Its embassy was occupied for 444 days. You had the 2006 attack on U.S. Forces in Saudi Arabia in the Khobar Tower. You've had the support for non-state allies who are deeply anti-American, including Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas and the Houthis in Yemen. So there are a lot of reasons to be hostile against. And you've had, of course, the rhetoric on Israel, the Holocaust denial conferences that took place at a certain period under Ahmadinejad when he was president. So there's a good reason for hostility, but fact of the matter is, you reached, as imperfect as it may have been, in 2015, an agreement on curbing Iran's nuclear program that Iran religiously abided by. And it was the United States, Trump in his first term, who unilaterally walked away from that agreement. So, in other words, you've got a very complex relationship where there are multiple shades of gray that often got lost or get lost.
The other thing I wanted to talk about with regards to Iran is I think there's often this conflation of the grievances and very legitimate concerns of people within Iran versus maybe the Iranian diaspora. And I don't even think the diaspora is unified. There was protests, or there was a rally in, I believe it was Westwood in LA, and one of my friends was telling me about it, and there was a truck that seemed to be affiliated with MEK that just like drove through the ralliers. So there's even that like MEK types versus pro monarchy types within the diaspora, and I feel like all of this gets glossed over. There's the diaspora isn't itself unified on everything, and I'm not sure the diaspora and people on the ground in Iran necessarily have completely the same grievances, if that makes sense. What do you think? Am I off base here?
Well, first of all, exile communities, diasporas are often divided. Iran doesn't speak with one voice. There are multiple voices in Iran. The Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps is not a homogeneous unit. There are multiple views and thought schools within the IRGC. On top of that, you saw that in Iraq, you always have a tension between the diaspora community that has been away from the country for a long time and those that have been in the country and were the ones that really were taking the brunt of whatever was happening. If you take the case of Reza Pahlavi, the son of the deposed Shah, sure, his name was touted by protesters, at least a segment of the protesters. There were placards with his picture on them. Whether that was support for his return and the return for the monarchy, or whether this was a way of, or in the view of the protesters, an ultimate insult of the government that had deposed the Shah, I think is at this point anybody's guess. What I think is true is Reza Pahlavi has a significant support base in the diaspora. He doesn't have a significant support base in Iran. And the degree to which he has a support base is among a slice of ethnic Persians, who account for 50 to 60% of the population. More importantly, which is another reason why these protests were not going to lead to regime change, is that he does not have an infrastructure in Iran. I mean, if you go back to Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the leader of the 1979 revolution, he had thousands of mosques. He had charities. He had a broad segment of the population buying into his leadership, some for religious reasons, some for purely opportunistic reasons. They saw it as an opportunity to challenge the Shah, if not overthrow the Shah. And they believed that, particularly some of the more secular elements and some of the ethnic minorities, they believed that the regime that came after the Shah would need them to run the country, in the belief the clerics would not be able to do so. And they were severely disappointed in that. So, yeah, I mean, there is no unified opposition. The Mujahideen Khalq, the MEK that you mentioned, was a guerrilla movement, an urban guerrilla movement that operated in Iran for a very long time. It was, in fact, designated as a terrorist organization by the United States because of the killing of 3 US officials. But it lost fundamentally any support it had, certainly in Iran, but also in broad segments of the Iranian diaspora, even though it was feted by various US administrations and taken off the terrorism list. It was in many ways despised because during the Iran-Iraq war, it sided with Iraq.
I wanted to ask you as well, and I don't want to moralize about it, but I find that discussions with people here in the US about these things greatly aggravate me. I had someone that I was talking to, off air, that's just a friend, saying they were interested in the idea of Iran being a parliamentary constitutional monarchy, and they kept talking about the UK and Sweden. And I was like, why are you as like a US citizen that has no interest in Iran other than what you hear in the news, talking about what the future of Iran is going to be if the Islamic Republic falls? And I feel like this is an issue with the Israel-Palestine conflict as well, where a lot of people that have no skin in the game are arguing for how things should be solved. I'm wondering, do you think this is foolhardy? I don't want to get too much into moralizing about it, but I feel like sometimes people in the US act as if they're going to be the ones to make the decision. Oh, it's going to be a two-state, a one-state, it'll be a parliamentary constitutional, and I don't think they're going to necessarily have that say.
Well, they may very well not. But first of all, it's not surprising that Americans may think that they are able to shuffle the deck the way they want it to be shuffled, given America's a superpower. I mean, if anything, Trump would reinforce that notion with all of that we were discussing earlier in this conversation. But I will also say that, we uphold freedom of expression. You're entitled to have an opinion on whatever whatever it may be. You're entitled to express that opinion. Now, whether I think that you're qualified to make that judgment or not is another story. But you have the right to say and believe and to express whatever you want to express. So I'm not going to take on whoever it is who has some recipe for the resolution of Iran's problems on the grounds that you have no right to speak because you have no skin in the game. Now, I may take him on the credibility of his argument and the his or her credibility in terms of understanding what's going on. But that person has a right to say and believe whatever he or she wants.
No, and I think that's fair pushback. I just I sometimes think that people will. I mean, you're right. People have a right to their opinion. I just get frustrated when people that don't seem to know the region will offer their,
Well,
yeah.
I mean, it goes back to, your question about the media or the think tank world, where you, as I said, you get experts coming out of the woodwork. This is the story of the day, and you want to be counted in. Whether or not you have the background, the knowledge, the expertise, the experience is a different question. Now, that's their right. And it's, for a discerning consumer to decide which journalists, which analysts he or she believes have an understanding and produce something that is grounded in reality.
In terms of how do you think Iran adapts from all of this? I mean, it is facing a major challenge, I think, going forward. And these protests, I think, were a very big deal this time around in a way that it felt different this time. So what are the possible scenarios that could be playing out with Iran going forward?
I mean, look, Iran has proven very adaptable and very resilient. Uh, let's uh, let's face it, it has faced severe pushback, mind you, much because of its own dealings and its own positions, but nonetheless, it has done so for a very long time. Uh, I, you know, I think you saw already adaptation in the beginning of or in the first phase of the recent protests, in which the government responded, not initially with a crackdown. Even more importantly, even it legitimized the protesters' concerns and came out with programs, whether that was too little, too late, being neither here nor there right now. But there was adaptation. That started to change when you got the politicization of the protests, which was inevitable, and then when you got the violence against the security forces. So, in a sense, and what you're now seeing now, whether that's the result of, as Trump would like to believe, that's the result of the threat of U.S. intervention or not. You've also had, I think it was yesterday, the Iranian judiciary essentially saying we're going to be lenient with those rioters, as they view them, that were not involved in the violence, that were not associated with any potential foreign intervention, and the judiciary has given them 3 days to basically report or surrender, and has promised to deal with them leniently. Now, is whether that you want to call that is adaptation as a matter of principle. Whether that's the kind of adaptation one wants to see, again, is a different question.
I wanted to also go back to Venezuela. You said that this is different than Panama, and I didn't follow up on that. And I know my listeners will be yelling at me if I don't follow up on that with you. Maybe you can go through what the differences are.
Well, I mean, the one major difference was that you had public support. You had U.S. troops in the region. The United States, the successor to Noriega was installed within the first 24 hours. Now, he was installed on a U.S. military facility, but nonetheless, he was installed. So you had a transition to a democratic government almost immediately. None of that was the case in Venezuela. You did not. Again, Venezuela, you had harsh repression, but you did not have the protests. There were no military forces on the ground. So, and it was also, of course, it wasn't an invasion. Panama was an invasion. In Panama, also, once you were the new president was installed, you had politicians, prominent politicians, who favored the overthrow of Manuel Noriega and the U.S. intervention, being flown around the country on U.S. military helicopters to be able to speak to various groups and garner support for the new government. None of that was in Venezuela. First of all, you didn't have mass protests. Now, one reason you probably didn't, or a major reason why you didn't have mass protests, was the harsh, the repressive regime. You didn't have a military infrastructure on the ground. You weren't replacing the regime. You were taking out the president and leaving the regime in place.
That's what I was going to say. Delcy Rodriguez is, you know, part of the party, part of the regime that Maduro ran. So it's not really a regime change in that sense.
No, but in Donald Trump's eyes, it probably confirms that coercion and intimidation works. He basically sees Delcy Rodriguez and the government in Venezuela, which was Maduro's government, and Delcy Rodriguez was a hardliner, very loyal to him. You've seen her and her government basically say, we're gonna fall into line. We're gonna work with you. We're gonna. So now, how long that lasts, we'll have to see. But it certainly, from Trump's perspective, is a success story.
Um, are there any concerns you have about where that sort of the coercion strategy of Trump could lead? I don't even mean in terms of how other states will respond. I just mean I'm a person that is very afraid of recklessness and hubris. I think that that leads to bad places for nation states. I think nemesis always comes back to correct hubris. Am I off base to think that's a possible outcome?
No, I don't think so. I mean, look, I think what happened in Venezuela is very concerning. Fact of the matter is that I think Donald Trump, one, believes that he can impose his will on whoever it may be. And Venezuela will have reinforced him in that image. Has respect for someone like the Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, or the Syrian president, Ahmed al-Shara, whom he sees as strong leaders, good leaders, tough leaders, smart leaders who have concentrated power in their own hands and can get things done, as opposed to European leaders, or for that matter, Benjamin Netanyahu, who are constrained by coalition politics, by democratic procedures, and by international law, although Netanyahu is not constrained by international law by any stretch of the imagination. And so you see that play out in Syria, for example. And so it raises, if you look at diplomacy over the last year internationally, diplomacy was focused on around Donald Trump, no matter what it was about, and not getting on the wrong side of Donald Trump. playing to his narcissism, megalomania, if you wish. And I think what that has done has only reinforced those characteristics of Trump. I think what you're seeing with Greenland, and we'll see how far that goes, that the Europeans for the first time are realizing that that's not working, and that they've been pushed to a point over Greenland where they have to take a stand. Now, how firm a stand they take, I think will be clear when we have the European summit this week, and what they do with what is called the anti-coercion instrument, which would basically initiate a trade war, depending on how that instrument is applied. But it essentially would bar U.S. goods and services, or restrict the entry of U.S. goods and services into the European market. It would bar U.S. companies from participating in public tenders. You're talking about a war in one of the most important, if not the most important, trade relationship in the world. I think, in that sense, Venezuela is a very dangerous precedent.
I also had to ask, NBC News reported on January 10th that Netanyahu hopes to taper Israel off U.S. military aid in the next decade. How significant do you think Netanyahu's proposal about that is? This idea that they're going to gradually phase U.S. military aid over the next decade?
I think it's very important. I think that you are going to see in the next 2 years a restructuring of the U.S. military relationship that is going to have consequences. Now, what Netanyahu is doing is trying to preempt. So if you view the Heritage Foundation as, in many ways, the brain trust of the Trump administration, last year, the Heritage Foundation came out with a plan to restructure the U.S.-Israeli military relationship. And the U.S.-Israeli military relationship is up for discussion because the 10-year memorandum of understanding that was signed by Barack Obama, which granted Israel $3.8 billion a year in military aid, has to be renewed by 2028. What the Heritage Foundation said was, let's take a time span from 2029 to 2047. In those 19 years or whatever it is, 18 years, Israel gets, as a matter of principle, $4 billion a year. But every year, it has to increase its military purchases from the United States by $250 million. The notion being that at the end of this process, Israel would be a security partner rather than a recipient. Given the divisions within the Make America Great against Trump's Make America Great Again support base, Netanyahu fears that Trump may not want to enter into an arrangement similar to the one that Barack Obama accepted. And of course, it was a mild move, but nonetheless, you had the Biden administration at one point puts limited restrictions on arms sales to Israel. I think it was the big 2,000-pound bombs, which may have been a wake-up call for Netanyahu. And you've had, since Netanyahu spoke, you've had Lindsey Graham come out, and he is either on his way to Israel or in Israel, come out and say, why wait 10 years? Let's move faster. So, I think that Netanyahu saw these trends and decided to want to preempt them before it's too late.
Do you think there's also elements of the Israeli right wing that may be pushing him in that direction as well? I only ask this because I know Jonathan Pollard, who was very controversial, and I don't want to like emphasize him too much because I sort of see him as almost like a scandal celebrity figure. But I know in the past years he's running for Knesset now, I believe. But even he was sort of like saying before this, like maybe 2 years ago, oh, we need to like stop relying on the U.S. Is there an element of that amongst the Israeli right that is also playing into um,
Look,
Netanyahu's thinking?
if you feel that you are an embattled state, which Israel has long viewed itself as, you want to reduce dependencies. I don't think that this is necessarily a question of right, left, up, or down. I mean, it's from Israel's point of view, irrespective of what government is in place, it makes perfect sense. Just as it makes perfect sense that the Europeans should long have been invested in their own defense much more, rather than rely on the United States as if it was going to be there forever.
Closing out here, this conversation has been a little bit more difficult for me because I feel not just this conversation, but my conversation with everyone lately when it comes to international relations has been difficult because I feel like we're in like the parable of the blind man and an elephant, where they're each touching different parts of the elephant and they're each coming to different conclusions. And I I feel like we're in uncharted waters and I don't want to like overstate anything when it comes to what the future holds. Where do you see us as being at? Because I'm having a hard time even knowing what's going on anymore. It just feels like we're in really deep waters.
We, in my mind, we are in uncharted territory, particularly in terms of anything that we have experienced in our lives, and that goes for much of you a few truly elderly people excluded, but by and large, for the last anything in the last 80 years, this is uncharted waters, and it's unclear where this is going to land. I think that Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, in his speech for which he's received a standing ovation in Davos, hit it on the head. This is a world order that is deeply troubled and challenged, in part because it was hypocritical.
Well, he said it was he basically said it was based on a fiction.
Yeah, I mean, but as I heard what he said, he basically said we adhered to or claimed to adhere to certain standards, but in practice, primarily because of America's definition of the rule of law, didn't adhere to them in practice, and that was going to catch up with the system at some point in time. And you now have, that's what, in part, what brings the far right to the center stage. It's what brings Trump to the U.S. presidency. And as a result, we are facing immense challenges, and it's unclear where this is going to, what's going to come out at the end of it.
In terms of your approach, how do you approach it responsibly? Because I think some people are jumping to like I see people yelling we're in the opening salvo of World War III, and then other people saying, well, no, that's an overstatement. How do you what is your advice to people when it comes to discernment?
Look, I don't think that we are on the verge of World War III now. I'm not saying that World War III will not occur, but I don't think that we're on the verge of it. I don't think that Trump wants a world war. Venezuela was low-hanging fruit. Who's going to do anything about it? Whether Greenland is low-hanging fruit, we're going to have to see. Western democracies certainly had double standards when it came to Gaza. Now, what happens if Taiwan becomes a true flashpoint, and you get a military conflagration between the United States and China? That's a different story. I don't think China wants a military engagement. It's been very careful not to provoke the United States beyond certain lines. I think that's true also for the United States with regard to China. So, I mean, those are the hopeful signs, if you wish.
If there was any one thing you wanted my listeners to get out of this conversation, I thank you because I think you're always careful in how you frame things and talk about things. You don't try to overstate anything. But I feel like in a lot of ways we're working in the dark. So what do you hope my listeners get out of this, and where would you want to shine a light?
Look, I think that there are two major dangers or threats. One is a lot of the things that we talked about in terms of international politics and geopolitics, but the other is domestic. We have seen, if you wish, what I would call the rise of a critical mass of civilizationalist leaders. And what we've seen is a hollowing out of democratic institutions. You see that in Israel. You see that in Hungary. You see that in India. You see the rise of the far right in Europe. Although, interesting, the far right now has a real problem. And that problem is Greenland. So, you look at the far right in Denmark, their leader, Morten Messerschmidt, was for the longest period, part of last year, running around with selfies of himself and Trump. Now he's criticizing the Danish government for even engaging with Trump on the issue of Greenland. Trump has challenged, has put the far right in a bind because the far right are nationalists. There's no way that they can concede on something like Greenland. But coming back to your question, so you've seen the rise of the far right, you've seen the rise of Trump, who again is certainly attempting to hollow out democratic institutions in the United States. And I think that that's a matter of real concern, and that's a matter where people can try and do something about it.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. Even with the Venezuela stuff, I saw that Marine Le Pen was even critical of Trump on that. So even beyond Greenland, there's even been criticism in the European far right of Trump on Venezuela.
Sure, but Greenland cuts to the core.
Right.
Venezuela doesn't.
You know what? I needed to ask you this before, just to reiterate it for new listeners. You mentioned this issue of civilizational or civilizationalist leaders. Can you maybe briefly explain what you meant by that? Because I have newer listeners that may not be familiar with your thinking on that.
Sure. I mean, basically, what I mean with that is you have leaders who, one authoritarian, but what sets them apart is that they think in civilizational terms. They define their borders in civilizational terms rather than in national terms. So if you take Vladimir Putin believes in Russia's world, Ruski Mir. And Russia's world is anywhere where you have Russian speakers or people who adhere to Russian culture. Donald Trump's concept of the Western Hemisphere as basically being an American hemisphere, in which he sees Venezuela as the first step of ensuring that he has governments in place that are going to walk lockstep with the United States. You go to the new Indian Parliament, it has a map on its wall of Greater India, which incorporates other parts of South Asia. You've had Viktor Orban of Hungary claiming parts of Romania. And of course, you have Benjamin Netanyahu with his vision of a greater Israel. So that's what, but the important thing is, this is not just one leader. And you can make the same claim, by the way, for Xi Jinping. Singaporeans who are 85% of ethnic Chinese origin, get very upset when China refers to them as a Chinese country. So, and I think that the rise of a critical mass of such leaders. I mean, the three largest, most important countries in the world are ruled, China, Russia, and the United States are ruled by civilizationalist leaders. And that explains to some degree why we are where we are in terms of the challenges to the system.
And I also had to get this in real quick. I'm sorry I've kept you so long, but you mentioned the Carney speech at Davos. How significant do you think the trade deal is between Canada and China? Is this like a changing of the guard?
Well, I think it's too early to jump to that conclusion. What I do think is that Donald Trump's tariff policies, by definition, mean that countries are going to diversify their trade relationships. At this point, the United States is not a reliable partner, and you're dependent on the whim of one man, who many perceive as unpredictable. So the fact that Carney would go off to China or wherever else, in terms of broadening Canada's trade relations, particularly given that Canada is within the orbit of Trump's civilizationalist ambitions. He recently tweeted a map which had the American flag not only on Venezuela and Greenland, but also on Canada. And he's spoken about Canada in the past as the 51st state. So, it's 1 and 1 is 2 that Carney's going to be diversifying his relationships.
So I want to thank you again for coming on Parallax Views. These conversations are always insightful, but like I said, we're in uncharted waters, so I don't really know like what else can be said. But how can my listeners keep up with your work, and just plug the Substack, if you will?
Sure. I would appreciate and welcome subscribers to my Substack, which is called The Turbulent World with James M. Dorsey. You can find it at jamesmdorsey.substack.com. Please subscribe. And if possible, please become a paid subscriber.
Please do.
That's what makes the blog possible.
Yeah, and James is one of my favorite people, so please do subscribe and become a paid subscriber. We'll leave it at that. Thank you again, James Dorsey, and thank you for staying longer than expected.
It's always a pleasure, JG. I enjoy these conversations.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers' credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/parallaxviews, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program. Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.